Recently I sat down with a dear friend, Dr. Garnet Pike. We had this conversation about the reality and the presence of the Holy Spirit. Not only the Pentecostal experience of Spirit baptism and speaking in other tongues, but the totality of the work of the Spirit in our lives. It was really significant to me personally, and I think it'll be very significant to all of you who will join in and take time to listen to this.
We have to follow Jesus, and the question in my mind becomes then, how far are you willing to go with Jesus?
Wow, yeah.
And if Jesus is our example, then let's follow him all the way. If you're going to follow Jesus to get into the kingdom, you have to go to John 3. Nicodemus had trouble discovering what that meant, but Jesus told him, you cannot enter the kingdom unless you're born of the Spirit or born again.
Right.
So Jesus, in a sense, was born of the Spirit, born again, and so followers are to follow him, be born again. And then secondly, if you follow Jesus, he submitted to the waters of baptism. In the waters of baptism, John the Baptist said, you don't need to be baptized. You have no sin. But Jesus responded and said, I'm doing it to fulfill righteousness. So you have his birth by the Spirit. You have his being baptized in the water to fulfill righteousness, which is the second distinct word. And so then, if you take it over, those who have been saved, like Nicodemus, been born again, been born of the Spirit, they need to go to another dimension of yielding to the righteousness that God has placed in them.
Yeah.
When you put that together, you see a real parallel. But then Jesus went on further, and it came time, that when he was going to have to depart, he says, it's essential that I'm going to depart, but I'm going to send the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And he told his disciples, he said, boys, you got to stay in Jerusalem until, and don't leave until you've received the baptism of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Which I'm sending from the Father. The Father has given us the promise, and I wrote my little book capturing that title, Receiving the Promise of the Father. And so they were obedient to that. They waited in the upper room, and on the day of Pentecost, when it was fully come, then God the Father poured it out, and Jesus baptized us in the Holy Spirit at that point in time. And so we have the evidence of it, of speaking in other tongues. So I see a great parallel between the life of Jesus that we must follow. And so when Jesus came to the baptismal in the river Jordan, the other dimension, which I failed to mention, is that fact that while that was happening, the Spirit descended and the Spirit remained on Jesus. So the same pattern is for us as believers. If we are baptized in the Holy Spirit, the Spirit comes upon us, and the Spirit is to remain on us and be with us, just like it was with Jesus. I just urge people to understand, if you're following Jesus, there's no stopping off point.
Right.
Some people get saved and they're just satisfied, and they have another experience, and satisfied with that, but they don't press on to the fullness. And God always operates in fullness. When you are filled or baptized in the Holy Spirit, you're filled with the Spirit. And Paul tells us, be filled with the Spirit. Then he tells us that, you be full with Christ, and you be filled with God, and you be filled with the Spirit. He wants us to operate in the fullness of the Spirit. And the great significance, as far as I'm concerned, is that the Holy Spirit takes the most unruly member of your body, that is the tongue, and he takes it and can curse and bless, but he takes it so he can magnify and glorify God.
Right.
And if that unruly member can become an instrument that glorifies God, then it's a sign to you that there's no area in your body that he cannot take dominion over and transform, so it begins to glorify God.
I want you to talk a little bit about spiritual gifts There was a time in my life, and again, I wasn't taught this. I just think it was just, I didn't understand it, had not thought it through. But I remember thinking when I was younger, okay, you don't really have these spiritual gifts until you have spoken in other tongues, which is really not true. When you're born again, the Holy Spirit lives inside of you. You can't be born again unless the Holy Spirit,
Right.
as you said earlier, brings conviction of sin, and He resides in you, and those gifts begin to already manifest themselves. Talk some about that, about spiritual gifts, and if you don't mind, even share a little bit about how you yourself, those gifts have operated in your life.
Well, first of all, I really feel, I went through that 54 days with COVID.
You were hospitalized.
Yeah, in the hospital, 54 days. And in that, God just really released to me, as a result of my granddaughters just saying, "I love you, Papa." I was in the valley of decision, and after hearing that longing plea, I came out of that. But as I came out, I began to realize the value of God's mercy and God's grace. I've been introduced to that dimension of life like I've never knew it before. And out of that dimension, it drove me to look at my life, look at situations, and get a better perspective. And I think part of our problem is, and I want to be gracious here, is that we really do not understand God's purpose for us. And God's purpose from Genesis to Revelation is that the glory of the Lord come to the earth and cover the earth, and the knowledge of the Lord cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And so when it comes to the baptism of the Holy Spirit, if people do not, or even their Christian life, if people do not recognize then that God is in them, and we have been made in the image of God, so therefore we are to be image carriers of God Himself, and we cannot be fully image carriers of God and fully reflect God unless we're filled with the fullness of God. So it ties back into the purpose of the Holy Spirit is to be filled with the fullness of God. And then back in Genesis, God gave two mandates. One was that they mandate of the maintenance of the earth, and the other was, that you don't eat of the tree, the knowledge of good and evil. So I sort of simplify them. One was that you have moral assignments, but you also have a missional assignment.
Right.
And you can have a moral assignment and miss the missional assignment.
Wow.
And be more interested in, just me, myself, getting ready so that I'm ready when Jesus comes back to the earth, and have no interest in the missional assignment, whereas God says we are to be stewards of the earth.
Yeah.
And so God's revealed to me that if you put those two together, the moral assignment and the missional or vocational assignment together, then you can live in the fullness of life with real purpose.
Wow.
And right now, many people do not live in the fullness of life with a real purpose. And the real purpose is to be filled with God's glory, God's presence. And then as God's glory and presence fills you, let the riches of His mercy just overwhelm you. God is a wonderful, wonderful God, a gracious God. And basically, the Spirit of God, as we see in the Bible, the best is yet to come. Yeah. And that best yet to come is going to be when that glory of God transforms not only believers, but transforms the whole creation, and we got new heaven, new earth. And it's a wonderful, wonderful joy to be part of it and sense that God's moving.